Hi, everyone. Eric Prince here. Today I'm joined by Heather McDonald, someone I've spoken with, I think, 3 or 4 times now about the various activist activities going on. So today's discussion will be focused on her City Journal piece in the summer 2022 issue, The Corruption of Medicine. So Heather, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me back, Eric.
Of course. So as I just alluded to, we've sort of talked about these things happening at a few points, and as everyone knows, you write about them frequently. You've written about its impact on the ballet in your piece, Sniffing Out Racism and White Supremacy in the Ballet, back in 2020. We talked about it at our alma mater of Yale, but there's something about it in medicine that I think to a lot of people makes it all the more concerning, because these are life and death matters in a way that, as much as we appreciate the ballet or a museum, it seems like skin is really on the line here.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people have been naive and have believed that there'd always be a cordon sanitaire between the diversity juggernaut and the sciences, whether it's medicine or engineering or physics. That was completely naive. The demand for racial preferences is insatiable. There is no meritocratic standard that is safe, not a single one. You have the leaders of the medical profession, whether the AMA or the American Association of Medical Colleges or the deans of medical schools, the chairs of various departments within medical schools. They are all either actively on board this crusade to engineer racial diversity, and the only way you can do that is by lowering standards, I'm afraid. You can either have diversity or you can have meritocracy. Given the academic skills gap, you cannot have both. So these leaders are either actively involved in tearing down the standards that have given us the miracle of medical progress, or they are simply too scared and too cowardly to stand up and say there's something more important than racial proportions in medical school student body, on a staff, in a hospital, and that is saving lives and making sure that we have the best possible physician scientists doing our research and working in our operating rooms and reading x-rays.
So there's so many important things that I think you get at in the article, but you just alluded to one about people perhaps being too cowardly and the like to call it out. In the piece, you talk about it being, at some cases, quote, professionally suicidal, end quote, to push back on any of these tenets. And I think there are a lot of compelling sections of the piece, but the one that I think most stuck with me is what happened to the University of Pennsylvania nephrologist Stanley Goldfarb, who maybe you can recount a little bit. He questioned some of the pieties about the test scores, and he was basically run out of town. Before our interview, I checked his, I guess patients can rate a doctor online. It seems as though people had kind of come for his head after the fact in response to his comments and implying that he can't be a good nephrologist based on some of his views.
Well, a study had been published that is typical now in the era of diversity obsession, which looked at the fact that on a certain scale where faculty rate their students in the course of medical school on various clinical skills and knowledge and ability to function within a medical setting, that so-called underrepresented minorities, that is Black and Hispanic medical students, virtually all of whom, we know there are exceptions, of course, but there's not a single medical school in the country that is not practicing very large racial preferences in admissions. They are admitting Black and Hispanic students that would be with MCAT scores. These are the medical school admission exams, the standardized test, the counterpart of an SAT for medical school. These schools are admitting Black and Hispanic students with MCAT scores and GPAs in college that would be automatically disqualifying if presented by a white or an Asian applicant because they're so low. So not surprisingly, thanks to the mismatch effect, which has been laid out in great empirical detail by UCLA law professor Richard Sander, the students admitted under large racial preferences don't do as well in school because they're not at pitch, the teaching is pitched to a higher level of skill than they possess. Nobody's saying they shouldn't go to medical school. They're just saying go to a medical school where your skills are equal to your fellow students like everybody else. I mean, this is a huge handicap that we're slapping on to these racial preference so-called beneficiaries. So they don't do as well, and their ratings from their faculty, their professors are not as high. So a study came out looking at this fact and posited as the only allowable explanations for why there was a large gap in the ratings given by medical school faculty to Black and Hispanic medical students on the one hand, and to white and Asian students on the other. The only allowable explanations given by this study is systemic racism on the part of the faculty, disparities in the curriculum. The curriculum isn't sufficiently attuned to diversity. And there was a third that was also basically in the structural racism camp. And it called for future research in these three hypotheses. So Stanley Goldfarb, who was a nephrologist that is a kidney specialist at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School and had been a dean of curriculum at the school for years, but it was currently on emeritus status, he tweeted out, well, maybe there's another explanation, which is that the Black and Hispanic students are just not doing as well in school, which is the true explanation. You know, the faculty, I can tell you this, Erich, the faculty at medical schools, just as at every other academic institution, are not racist, period. These are liberal adults, colorblind. They want all of their students to succeed. They are not grading down Black and Hispanic students out of irrational prejudice. It ain't happening. And Goldfarb basically implicitly said that and said the grades are what they are. They are showing that there is an academic skills gap. So, of course, this produced an absolute meltdown in the social media sphere. He was, lambasted as a racist, and the medical school dean immediately sent out a letter to all of the so-called stakeholders or community members. I forget what nauseatingly PC term you now use.
Stakeholders is the new order of the day.
Well, I think in universities you call them affiliates somehow.
Oh.
So the dean sent out a message saying, I just want to remind you that it is safe to be on the University of Pennsylvania medical campus because Professor Goldfarb is emeritus. I want to remind you of that fact. So you can step on campus without feeling in threat of your lives from this white supremacist. And then another head of the entire University of Pennsylvania hospital system also sent out a reassuring note to the UPenn Medical School affiliate saying, of course, we are against systemic racism. We're as troubled by this statement as anybody else, but believe me, we're going to work to eradicate racism. So, I mean, this was completely ridiculous. Goldfarb had spoken the truth, and yet he was turned into a pariah. And he doesn't have to worry so much because he's emeritus. But people that are active faculty members look at examples like this and decide that they're just going to keep their head in the sand and allow standards to be torn down because they don't want to lose their jobs.
I know it's hard to choose, but among the various universities, it seems as though the University of Pennsylvania has been a particularly bad offender, from the water buffalo incident to the war on Amy Wax to this. It seems as though the University of Pennsylvania is kind of up at the top of the list of these universities doing what they do.
Well, it's at the top, but it is by no means the absolute pinnacle. There is no pinnacle. Yale, Harvard, they're all really, really bad. There is no safe harbor from this. Conservatives sometimes say, oh, it's just the attack on meritocracy, the hatred for Western civilization, that's just a sickness affecting elite Ivy League colleges. That's not true. That's a comforting fiction. This is in state universities, taxpayer funded. It's now entering community colleges. So yeah, the University of Pennsylvania is bad, but it's basically sort of whatever you look at. If the lens is focused at University of Pennsylvania, it'll find that. But you can look at Weill Cornell in New York, you know, the Yale Medical School. It's bad everywhere.
Yeah, and I know at Cornell, you cited legal insurrection, the piece, and I know Professor Jacobson at Cornell has tried to chronicle this at universities across the country of the state of things. But back to Dr. Goldfarb, it was interesting. I see he's now started an organization called Do No Harm, and I saw on his Twitter feed, he's been sharing a number of pieces, mostly at the Wall Street Journal, that have kind of tried to bring attention to this. So I wanted to ask you, Heather, do you think that, I know in recent months and years, for instance, there's been a renewed attention on the infiltration of these ideas into K-12 schools. Are you starting to see an effort by people like yourself and Dr. Goldfarb and other people to, including some of his authors at the Wall Street Journal, to sort of respond to this in the context of medical schools and hospitals?
Well, yes. I mean, Goldfarb has Do No Harm. He published, or let me see, no, I guess there was an editorial in the Wall Street Journal before my piece was excerpted, talking about the new faculty and curricular standards that the American Association of Medical Colleges is putting out, that is basically requiring that medical schools teach white supremacy and white privilege theory. And of course, all learning is zero sum. So every minute that a student spends learning how to regurgitate these vacuous bromides about white supremacy is a minute not spent learning about cell signaling in nematodes, or how to save somebody who's just come into an ER with a fatal heart attack, near fatal heart attack. So the Wall Street Journal wrote an editorial saying this is not a good idea. And for weeks on end, there was one letter to the editor after another from the various, you know, wise leaders in the medical profession denouncing the editorial and saying, of course, we have to fight systemic racism. That's what's responsible for racial health disparities. Not true. What's responsible for racial health disparities is behavioral disparities, different rates of obesity, lack of exercise, compliance with doctor medicine, doctor instructions, follow-up care, difficulties, you know, there are poverty-related difficulties and maybe in making appointments. In any case, the only allowable explanation for racial health disparities now within the federal government as well is racism, doctor racism. So they're fighting back very hard. And I hope that Stanley Goldfarb's organization will have a lot of success, but I know that people within the profession still feel that they dare not speak out. I recently was given a memo that the deputy director of the National Institutes of Health sent around, deputy director at the National Cancer Institutes, which is a branch of the NIH, and the National Cancer Institutes federally fund various national cancer centers that do research across the country. And the National Cancer Institutes have traditionally given a very generous award to the most leading cutting-edge cancer researchers to pursue high-risk research. This is research that is really pushing the envelope of what we know, trying out maybe radical hypotheses. These awards are called Outstanding Investigator Awards, and they have been very successful in broadening our understanding of cancer, you know, pathologies and possible relief from it. But of course, the problem is that those awards have not had a proportionally diverse recipient group. And so the deputy director for the National Cancer Institutes sent out a memo to the heads of these cancer centers saying, can you please change your criteria for nominating nominees to receive an award so that we can be more diverse. In other words, lower your standards, because that's the only way it's going to happen. And I asked the oncologist who sent me this email, when are you guys going to start fighting back? When are, I'm going to be blunt here, white and Asian researchers going to start fighting back against this unjustified attack on your hard work and success? And he wrote back and said, we value our jobs, we need our jobs. We see what happens to people who speak out. They get canceled for nothing. You know, it's not as if these heroic sacrifices actually change things. They really don't to date. And so he basically was saying, we're not going to stand up. He said the whole system is going to have to collapse. That'll take about 50 years and be rebuilt from scratch. So people that know better are still very scared. And I don't know how to overcome the fear factor. I think we need, I've proposed in an upcoming book, could there be some kind of organization that whenever somebody's accused of racism, for simply giving the facts and giving an alternative explanation to the lack of proportional representation in institutions, the alternative explanation to the structural racism argument, and say, no, there's actually a skills gap that explains why there aren't 13% Black cancer researchers or 13% artificial intelligence researchers at Google. It's the skills gap that explains that. Whether there could be an organization that would stand up and start putting those facts out about the extent of the skills gap, because the public doesn't know. They see racial disparities. There is not racial proportionality in our meritocratic institutions. That is undeniable. But nobody really understands how vast that academic skills gap is that explains it. You know, you have 53% of Black 8th graders who do not have even partial mastery of 8th grade math skills. Same in the 12th grade. Never closes. The gap never closes. Given those skills gaps, it is completely unrealistic to expect that every institution would be proportionally diverse absent racism.
So your piece, I think you outline, I alluded to a few pretty compelling accounts and a lot of facts and figures. What do people say to this? If one disagrees with your article, what do they say? Do they just say you don't get it, you're part of the problem? What do they say? Because it seems as though, you know, I'm trying to be as objective as possible, but it seems like it's a pretty persuasive case that's being made, as at least opposed to the alternative.
You know, Eric, I cannot tell you. There's just, facts don't matter anymore. And when you put facts out and they don't have any hope of changing minds, I really do despair. They just don't look at it. They will not acknowledge the skills gap. The one strategy is to say, well, the skills gap is itself the product of racism. Okay, that's fine. That's a different debate. I mean, I don't think it's the product of racism. I think it's a product of an anti-intellectual culture and a family culture, a breakdown of the family, and a family culture that does not value education the way, say, the Asian tiger moms do. But in any case, whatever the origins of the academic skills gap, it exists right now. And what I'm talking about is, are we going to tear down our meritocratic standards in our most essential science producing enterprises in order to engineer racial proportionality? And they simply have no answer to that. I mean, what also goes on, of course, that is the most corrosive aspect of all of this, is to deny that there is such thing as objective merit. And you have the AMA itself writing in its like 200-page guide for equity in the medical profession, calling the idea of meritocracy just a racist construct, you know, putting the sneering, ironic scare quotes around words like excellence or accomplishment. And what you have as well is objective standards of merit being watered down. So the medical school admissions tests, the MCATs, these colorblind standardized tests have been re-engineered to try to reduce the academic skills gap, so that now a quarter of all the test questions on the MCATs are about psychology and your ability to relate to people. They're not testing actual math skills or analytic skills. That's the same with other tests like the step 1 exam and the medical school licensing exam that I talk about in my piece, that has now gone to a pass-fail basis rather than grades because of the test score gap. And so they're denying that there's such a thing as objective scientific knowledge and trying to replace it with soft skills of communication. The sad fact is, as we've seen in universities, when with the holistic grading, even if you say, okay, what's really going to matter is leadership skills, that doesn't really close the test score gap either.
And there were a lot of things that I think one could be surprised by. One is on the front of the reactions to people who call out these orthodoxies. Others are in the cancer research grants you cited, where based on the number of Black research study participants or faculty, those can be up in question. But to me, on the question of the exams, was back to the University of Pennsylvania, this idea that I think I have the details correct, but if you have a 1300 in the SAT and maintain a certain GPA throughout college, the MCAT can be waived, which to me is just really concerning. We're going to have people coming into medical school who haven't even taken the basic benchmark of how we determine whether or not somebody ought to be in medical school.
Right. That's a special program for Black students exclusively, maybe for Hispanics, but it's geared towards Black students. And if you enroll in it during college and do in your summers, you do some kind of internship at the medical school, and you maintain a really mediocre GPA. I think I don't know, maybe it's 3.25. It may even be 2.75.
That's where a GPA where I think, as you argue in the piece, a white or Asian student would have basically no chance of getting into medical school, period.
Right. And GPAs are so meaningless today with grade inflation, and professors are also under massive pressure to leniently grade the underrepresented minorities. But so you maintain a mediocre GPA and have very mediocre SAT scores of 1300. Is it? I mean, that's just very low, for competitive entrance exams. You don't even have to present an MCAT, and there's other schools that are doing this sort of thing as well. So it's weird that they do it, because they don't really need to, because they've already are doing something called race norming, which is evaluating the objective scores of underrepresented minorities on a completely different scale than they are for whites and Asians. So that's where you get a Black student with mediocre GPA and MCATs has a 9 times greater chance of being admitted to medical schools than an Asian student with those same profile, and a 7 times greater chance of being admitted to a medical school than a white student with those same profiles. So they're using completely different standards. So why they don't keep the MCATs just to be able to distribute students within the Black cohort, I don't know, but I think they just want to have no way of tracking how big the disparity really is.
I think that's a good point, because now with the MCAT being entirely eliminated, it seems that it's so out in the open and obvious that anyone who's paying attention, maybe that's the question, is, are people paying attention? They would say, hey, wait a minute, what's going on?
Well, the other thing that's happening is there's a concerted effort to destroy every last indicator of the academic skills gap and to destroy these standardized tests. That's why the University of California has banned the submission of SATs. They're not just saying, well, we'll look at it.
Mind-boggling to me.
Excuse me?
It's mind-boggling to me because I remember a couple of years ago when people would say they're going to ban the SAT, you would think, how could they do that? This is what people have been doing for decades. It is kind of such a rite of passage. You have to take the SAT. This is how we compare people. They couldn't possibly do this, but sure enough, and like a lot of things, I think COVID may have been the excuse.
Well, yeah, I mean, this was coming a long time before COVID, and COVID is over, and they took this decision when COVID is over. The reason they've done that is they want to put the College Board out of existence. The College Board is the organization that delivers these standardized tests, whether it's the PSAT, the SAT, the GREs. I think maybe the MCATs are a different organization. But in any case, they want to just destroy their clients. So nobody's taking these tests any longer. They're not paying the fees. And so the College Board has to go out of existence. Because as long as we have some objective test that shows the academic skills gap, that does provide the alternative explanation to the structural racism explanation. So we can't allow these organizations to live any further. And what they're doing as an intermediate measure is to make it very hard to get the actual racial data breakdowns.
Right.
The MCATs used to be given out showing the different cohorts, how many of each racial group were in the bottom cohort of the test scores versus the highest cohort. They don't provide that information. I spent months in battle with the medical school oversight agency that delivers the MCATs, trying to get an updated table, that the one they used to give, and they put me off. I mean, I would have to send one set of questions after another to another group, and finally I said, sorry, no can do. And so they're narrowing. Richard Sander, who I mentioned before, the UCLA law professor, he has battled with the California Bar Association to try and get their what should be publicly available data on students' LSAT. These are the law school admissions test scores and how they do in law school, how they do passing the bar, to further confirm his mismatch effect. And he's been blocked there. He's been blocked everywhere.
Because Heather, I remember back in 2018, we were talking about this as applies to law schools. And I know obviously you're somebody who's been to a law school and are very familiar with how this plays out in law schools. Do you see a lot of differences? Is it just more the same progressing towards medical schools? Or since we were talking about that in 2018, are things now more extreme in the post-George Floyd moment, so to speak, at the medical schools?
Everything is more extreme in the post-George Floyd medical school. There's no question. I mean, that produced a species of mass hysteria. I mean, literally mass psychosis among America's mainstream institutions, where they all got down on their knees and copped to phantom racism. You know, there are not, our mainstream institutions, again, it's just like law, medical school professors, they are not racist. They are not discriminating against qualified Blacks. The opposite is the case. If you are competitively qualified and you show up at Google, they are going to, fly you there. They're going to give you every red carpet treatment. You are going to be the first person hired. That's true in every bank, every venture capital fund, every law school, every law firm. You write your ticket if you are competitively qualified, underrepresented minority today. But we had every institution saying, oh, woe is me, we apologize, we're discriminating right and left, we're part of America's white supremacist culture. And the medical schools certainly upped their hysteria. Now, we had in the 2014, we had the White Coats for Black Lives movement, where you had these medical students would lie down on the ground and in sympathy with the alleged victims of fatal police brutality, Black victims. Another fiction there, the idea that Blacks are overrepresented among victims of fatal police shootings. They're not when you take crime rates into account.
That's right, because at a few points when you bring up these statistics, remind me a little bit of your Wall Street Journal piece, which I think was just days after George Floyd death, which was kind of going through the numbers and all. So very, very similar. And I think, kind of this focus on just the pure numbers and stats of it.
Well, we got to get them out there when we can, as long as we can, because as I say, the people who control the bastions of our culture are, for some reason or another, it's absolutely mysterious, committed to this self-annihilation. They want to
You have,
tear down. They want
have
to
any-
tear. Go
sorry, go
ahead.
ahead. Do you have any insight as to why they're so committed to this? Because I think a lot of us look at it and we sort of have our various theories and we say, okay, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. I think it's 60% that. But again, it doesn't seem to fully compute for a lot of us when we say, why are these people so committed to sort of undermining these things that they've built or been part of building or supposed to be upholding? Why do they want to do this, especially in medicine?
Well, it's sort of a chicken and egg problem, or infinite regress problem. I can say that the leaders of institutions are terrified of being criticized by the left-wing press of racism if they speak honestly about the skills gap, and if they don't genuflect to the diversity notion that any racial disparity in an institution must be due to racism. But that just puts off the question, well, why is the mainstream media committed to that idea? And then the other question is, these leaders of medical schools or engineering departments or physics departments or the federal science agencies, are they doing this merely out of fear, or do they sincerely believe it?
Right.
And I'm inclined to think that a very large proportion do sincerely believe it. I think that human beings are capable of holding, as we know, wildly dissonant ideas and principles. And part of them may see the success that we've had through meritocratic science and be able to see, I mean, this is my own explanation. When you have college presidents saying that we're a racist, when Princeton or Yale says we're a racist institution, and yet if those presidents, college presidents, are at all aware of what's going on in their institution, they know that every faculty search is one desperate lunging to find any remotely qualified female or underrepresented minority they can hire. So they know empirically that it is not a racist institution, and yet they say it is a racist institution. How can they hold those absolutely mutually exclusive propositions in their minds? And yet they do. And so I'm going to fall back on a conventional explanation. I'm hardly new in saying this. There's the self-righteousness of believing that you are among the few that have the courage to stand up against those redneck MAGA supporter deplorables that are the source of American racism, the people that Joe Biden loves to go around accusing of systemic white supremacy. And so this gives you that frisson of virtue and noblesse oblige. But then I think that there is obviously a strain of guilt that is quite understandable and that we come at by very legitimately, because this country does have an absolutely horrible, deplorable, hypocritical, gratuitously nasty past that cannot be. It's very hard to express how outrageous the decades upon decades of violation of our so-called founding principles were. That is absolutely true. However, I can acknowledge that without any qualification. I can say that the 1619 Project is right about white supremacy in our past. There did seem to be something about the white American psyche that depended on putting Blacks in their place. That is true. The 1619's history is wrong, and they're also wrong about the present. We are not that country today. We have done an unforeseeable but actual about face so that now the reality in our world is not white privilege, it's Black privilege.
And not only that, but also in medicine as well. And as you allude to in the article about some hesitancy on the part of certain Black would-be test respondents. And we're familiar, for instance, with Dr. Kligman from the University of Pennsylvania and Holmesburg Prison and the Rett experiments there and Tuskegee syphilis. So even in medicine as well.
True. But that, that's been a long time in the past. And as long as the medical profession keeps harping on this phony conceit that, oh, medicine is racist, it increases the hesitancy among Blacks to get treatment that they need. Nobody talked about this, but you want to talk about vaccine hesitancy, go to the Black population.
100%.
And that helps explain why they had higher mortality rates. The other thing that explains it is their much, much higher obesity rates. Nobody wants to talk about that either. But if you want Blacks to come in and get treatment for diabetes and follow up on their prenatal care appointments, postnatal care appointments, which is not happening to the extent it should, do not go around saying the medical profession was racist and is racist today.
So kind of two remaining questions that I want to ask. One is, and we've talked about a little bit, about who are the main drivers of this in medicine. And I think a lot of ink was spent on the accreditation bodies, and they seem like a very important part of it. And then the other that I'm obviously the grant makers, and then as well, sort of the most prestigious of the journals, New England Journal of Medicine, as you and Jordan Peterson and other people have pointed out, have kind of been just parading out endless sorts of articles, some of which seem to contradict basic science about race. So I'm just trying to figure out who is mostly, do we think, pushing this? And then obviously we also, on top of it, compounding it, as you allude to, this sort of culture of fear. Maybe if you're retired or you have like my cousin Mike, and you have your own urology practice somewhere out in Michigan, you might be able to talk about this. But if you're at a teaching hospital, especially if you're younger or resident, you probably can't talk about this at all. Who is mostly driving this, do we think?
Well, first of all, I want to just follow up. You say they take sort of unscientific positions regarding race. That's absolutely true. It is a absolute required dogma of faith, tenet of faith, that race is a social construct. There is no such thing as race. That's simply wrong. There are genetic markers of race. They absolutely correspond with people's self-identification in racial groups and identification of others. Nicholas Wade has written about this very eloquently. So that's not true. The paradox is, they say on the one hand that there's a race is unreal, it's a social construct, and yet they're also slapping cancer research with these absolutely cumbersome red tape requiring that their clinical trials be racially proportionate, and that they spend a huge amount of time trying to recruit Blacks into clinical trials who don't want to come because of the suspicion, or they're testing a drug that does not affect Blacks. Recently, I was told about a woman who was involved in a clinical trial for a cancer drug for a cancer that is overwhelmingly affects whites, but because she didn't have enough Blacks in her trial, she lost her federal funding. So much for that cancer drug. You can say goodbye to that.
It's really horrifying, because these are people whose lives could actually be saved. This is what I was getting at before a little bit with the ballet. I guess it's one thing, not that I'm in favor of it, but it's one thing if ballet is sort of bastardized, but it's another thing that people who need Alzheimer's treatment or cancer treatment or whatever they're working on, lives are potentially being imperiled because of these new orthodoxies.
Right, but they're contradictory orthodoxy. It cannot both be the case that race is a social construct, and you need to spend half of your time and half of your grant money trying to recruit a racially proportionate trial population. Choose one or the other.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense at all.
No, if race is a social construct, it doesn't matter who's in your clinical trial. But the NIH imposes these requirements, so they're spending vast amounts. There was a conference call over the summer by one of the main cancer drug pharmaceutical companies, and they said, we're spending half of our time now with these diversity requirements for clinical trials, and we don't know what to do. In any case, to get back to your original question, what's driving this? It's coming from everywhere. There's not a single source. It's now indigenous to medical schools. Every scientific journal is publishing crap, articles that are saying the only allowable explanation is systemic racism. They're all choosing their editors and their researchers, their authors based on race. Somebody recently sent me a poll that was sent out by Elsevier Press, which publishes Cell and other high impact journals, asking, it's unbelievable, the granularity now of the racial categories. It's asking readers, and this is with an end to how they're going to set their racial quotas up for publishing and what articles they'll accept. And basically, so if you're a white or a male Asian heterosexual researcher, forget it, your research won't get published. But they're asking people, these are the categories: Western Europe, Greece, Sweden, United Kingdom, Eastern Europe, Hungary, Poland, Russia, North Africa, Egypt, Morocco, Sudan, Sub-Saharan Africa, West Asia, Middle East, South and Southeast Asia, East and Central Asia. I won't go on. So they are now going to start dividing up medical article authors and editors based on these unbelievably minute categories of racial difference.
So is the idea that if I'm Hungarian in heritage rather than French, I might have a better chance of getting my article published?
Exactly. So there's new intersectionalities that are possible.
Well, I don't know, Heather, I'm reading this article and I'm really kind of despairing for all of us. If we, as you said, get in a car accident or need an MRI, this seems pretty not good.
No, it's terrible. It is absolutely terrible. There is no question that it is going to slow down medical progress. No question. People are spending so much time on diversity. If they're writing a grant now to get a federal grant for Alzheimer's, they have to spend more time filling out their diversity, equity, and inclusion page, showing how their grant helps diversity, what they're going to do in their lab. The Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which is the biggest private funder of medical research, has a new project for diversity in labs. They want to have happy labs that are diverse. And so unless you can show that you've got a happy, diverse lab, you're not going to get funded, even though you may have the best team for working on Parkinson's disease.
Right.
If they are overwhelmingly white and Asian, forget it. You had the head of the National Institutes of Health, Francis Collins, saying that he would no longer participate in scientific conferences if there were manels there. The manels is the phrase for a scientific panel that is disproportionately male. Well, guess what? Sorry guys, here's who's done medical science and progress in the past. Overwhelmingly European males. I do not care to see females on a panel if they are not the best qualified scientists, but that's now what's happening. Is scientific conferences are being determined based on sex and race. It's going to slow down medical progress, and it is also going to put physicians in the ER and the operating room who are not the top qualified. There will be other considerations. Now, are there Black and Hispanic doctors who are the top qualified? Of course. But the problem of racial preferences is it puts a pall on everybody. And you will not know if a Black doctor walks through the door at your hospital, it is perfectly rational to worry that that person is an affirmative action beneficiary, not the best doctor. As Stephen Carter wrote in his 1990s book, Reflections on an Affirmative Action Baby, he will never know if he's been chosen because he's the best lawyer or is he the best Black lawyer? And patients can't know that either. Is this the best doctor or is it the best Black doctor? And those are not necessarily the same thing.
So quickly, Heather, do we have a sense of if this is as pervasive now in other parts of the world? Because we hear a lot, for example, Henry George and others say America tends to export a lot of their sort of racial dialectic they've determined white, non-white. Is this as far along, do we know, in the UK or Australia and other places?
That's really hard to say because sometimes you get word of what's happening in the UK and Australia, and it's really bad too. Canada's really bad. I mean, Canada is really bad on academic freedom and DEI statements. Nevertheless, I do think that Europe is less guilty, less prone to throw out its entire civilization. You had Emmanuel Macron, the president of France,
Right.
within the last year or so saying, we're not tearing down our statues. Are you kidding me? Voltaire, Racine, that non-starter. But I do think that the university systems are corruptible. They're easy targets. It's not as bad as elsewhere, however. Whether it will catch up eventually, I don't know. China obviously has its insane medical problems with the COVID hysteria. I mean, China is beyond belief. Nevertheless, in its science systems, regardless of how the politicians distort science, it is ruthlessly meritocratic. They are cultivating their best math talent. They're cultivating their best science talent. They don't give a damn for diversity quotas. They're promoting gifted and talented programs in math at the same time that we are tearing them down. We are trying to put a ceiling on the accomplishment of our most gifted students because they're not sufficiently diverse.
I think the outgoing governor of Oregon was one of the worst offenders of that.
Yeah, well, California is really bad too, and it's happening in Virginia, New York, it's everywhere.
So what you just said seems like kind of a persuasive rejoinder to a lot of people who in the United States, from kind of a domestic standpoint, have always said, well, as bad as things are here in America, they're much worse in other places. But I'm increasingly hearing from people in the UK and other places saying, it actually sounds like you guys have it worse right now.
We do. Well, there's no question we do. And so the only question is, how fast will it catch up?
Last question, Heather, and I think unfortunately you may have already answered it when you were quoting the person you were speaking with, who said that it seems as though for the next 50 years, things are going downhill. But I'm reading your piece and I'm feeling sullen because it seems as though all the powerful institutions are hell-bent on undermining, I'll say, sort of empirically minded medicine, empirically minded science in favor of politics. And we see that it's coming from grants from the federal government. It's coming from the medical schools. It's coming from accreditation bodies. It's coming from, I guess, you've kind of added to the dimension of starving the organizations that administer the standardized tests of funds. Is there any hope, or are we just doomed to kind of a reverse renaissance?
Well, I guess two questions. Is there a political lever here that can be used that's outside the institutions, and are there politicians willing to use that lever? I would say, looking at DeSantis, who's governor of Florida, who's pretty damn courageous in bucking, say, the COVID fallacies and other things. There may be politicians. So what power do they have over maybe public medical schools? One mini step towards correction is transparency and to require schools to actually publish the gaps in their admissions. Who are they admitting with what types of scores, and maybe for faculty as well. But I would say anybody that hates idiocy, that hates untruth, that hates living in a regime of deception and has any possibility of speaking out has to keep doing it. And I am, to be perfectly honest, I'm pretty hopeless. I'm pretty pessimistic. But if you have the will to fight, one still has to fight. And maybe, we could have had Trump. I'm not a defender of Trump. I'm not going to attack him across the board.
Right.
But you could have somebody within the federal government saying to the science agencies, extirpate every single diversity requirement.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I was going to kind of say maybe things wouldn't be as bad as Trump was still president, it's hard to kind of suss them out because the George Floyd moment and the Trump election happened around the same time. But I remember obviously he had that executive order about critical race theory in companies that contract with the federal government. So it seems as though if you had a Republican president, that might be a way to help this a little bit.
Right. You could say, you could both get, for the science agencies, you could say, from now on, you have to be colorblind.
Right.
No more color-coded grant making. And he could have gotten rid of every disparate impact regulation in the Code of Federal Regulations, that he could, get rid of the idea that a standard that has a disparate impact on a minority population is per se racist. Get rid of that and start a conversation. If there's statutes that need to be changed, ask Congress to change those statutes, start the conversation, and get rid of those aspects of the federal government that are requiring discrimination on the basis of race.
Heather, thanks so much for joining me and talking to me about all this. And unfortunately, I guess the way things are going, there'll probably have to be another piece about it marching through the next institution, because it just doesn't seem to be stopping. But thanks so much for talking to me, and a really interesting piece in City Journal. So glad we were able to chat about it.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate it.